Walter Hensley had walked that fence line so many times he could have done it in the dark. Sunday mornings, mostly. Same route, same steady pace, same habit his father had handed down to him without ever calling it a lesson. You check the posts, check the wire, check the corners, made sure the cattle hadn't tested a weak spot while nobody was looking. You did it because that was how a farm stayed a farm. Nothing dramatic about it. Just a man looking after what was his. That was the way it had always been on the Hensley place in Carroll County, Iowa, and on a cool September morning in 1987, Walter headed out expecting one more ordinary walk around land his family had worked since 1932. He was 68 years old then, lean in the way farm men get lean without trying, and he moved with the stubborn rhythm of a man who didn't believe much in sitting down before the day gave him a reason. He started near the north stretch, working west, passing the places he knew without having to think about them. A low dip where water sometimes held after rain. A run of posts Henry had reset back in the 50s. The old cottonwood tree his grandfather August had planted near the northwest corner a long time ago, when the place still felt new to him and he wanted something alive there to say, "This is where we begin." Walter saw the tree before he saw the problem, and for one second that made the whole thing stranger, because the tree was right where it had always been, broad and steady and older than some marriages, but the fence was not. He stopped dead. Men like Walter did not startle easy, but this hit him hard enough that he didn't move for several seconds. He just stood there and looked. The fence had been moved. Not sagged, not bent, not patched by somebody careless. Moved, lifted out of the ground, and set somewhere else by somebody who had no business touching it. He took a few steps forward, then more, and that cold feeling started spreading through him, because the farther he walked, the worse it got. It wasn't off by a little, not a few feet, not some mistake a man might argue over and fix after coffee. It was off by enough that you didn't need a survey to know something crooked had happened. By the time he reached the stretch where the line should have run toward County Road 7, Walter knew exactly what he was looking at. 40 acres were gone. Not on paper, not in theory, not in some courthouse drawer where city people shuffle documents and tell each other stories. Gone in the one way that matters to a man who works the land. On the wrong side of a fence. His best pasture, too. Bottomland along Brushy Creek. Good ground, strong grass, water that held, shelter for cattle in weather that could turn mean in a hurry. Ground his grandfather had grazed. Ground his father had cut hay on. Ground Walter himself had worked over and over again through 50 summers and a whole life that was tied to that place so tightly he could have walked half of it with his eyes closed. He didn't curse. That would have come easy, but Walter wasn't a loud man. He stood there with both hands on his hips and looked across land that still felt like his even with another man's fence cutting through it. Then he started walking the new line, slowly, counting with his eyes the way farmers count without numbers. Distance, angle, slope, old reference points. He knew every rise and turn of that property. He knew where a fence belonged the way other men know their own signatures. By the time he finished the line, the truth of it had settled hard in his chest. Somebody hadn't just made a mistake. Somebody had decided that if they build a lie strong enough, expensive enough, and official-looking enough, maybe nobody would be able to push it back. Walter turned and looked toward the neighboring land to the west and north, what used to be the Miller place, and he already had a pretty good idea whose lie it was. The Millers had been there a long time. Good people. Lost the place in the farm crisis like too many others did. Walter remembered the shame of those years on men's faces, remembered auctions where nobody talked unless they had to, remembered families loading what was left of their lives into pickups while strangers stood around pretending not to look. After the bank took the Miller land, a man from Chicago bought it cash. 800 acres. Didn't blink at the price. That man was Victor Kessler. Walter had met him only twice before, and that had been enough. Victor was the sort of man who wore money the way some men wear scent. You noticed it before he opened his mouth. Clean boots without a speck of mud on them, shirts that looked too nice for work, a watch that probably cost more than Walter had paid for his first tractor. He had made his money in Chicago real estate, or so people said, and by the mid-'80s he had more of it than any one man needed. He wasn't after a farmhouse and quiet weekends. He was after acreage, status, the kind of land a man could point at and call his without knowing the first thing about what it took to keep it alive. Walter had watched Victor come in like a buyer walking through an estate sale, seeing opportunity in places other people saw history. That alone didn't make him a thief. But fences do not move themselves in the night. Walter went home, washed his hands at the kitchen sink, and stood there longer than he needed to. His wife Ruth had known him long enough not to ask foolish questions when his face looked like that. She just dried a plate, set it down, and said, "What happened?" Walter kept his eyes on the window over the sink when he answered. Fences moved. She waited. How much? 40 acres. They got her still. Not dramatic, not loud, just still. Folks who have lived together a long time don't waste words when the thing is bad enough. "You sure?" she asked. "I'm sure." He turned then, and the anger was there but held down tight, packed in a way older men pack things when they know anger by itself doesn't fix much. He built it like he means to keep it. Ruth knew who he meant. Everybody nearby knew. Victor Kessler had been buying, improving, posting signs talking about plans. Hunting lodge, private access, fishing, big ideas for land other men once depended on to feed families. Walter pulled out a chair and sat down, not because he was tired, but because this was the kind of thing a man sat down for. "I'm going over there," he said. "Today." "Today." Ruth nodded once. "Then go before you get too hot about it." Walter gave her a look that almost passed for a smile, but not quite. He waited until after dinner, not out of politeness, but because he wanted to go with a steady mind. He drove the pickup over to the Miller place and found a construction trailer parked near the old farmhouse. There were workers around, some of them unloading materials, some pretending not to notice the farmer pulling up in a dusty truck. One of them pointed him toward Victor. Kessler came out of the trailer dabbing his hands with a monogrammed handkerchief, which told Walter about all he needed to know before the man said a word. Victor looked at him the way certain men from money look at older working men. Not like they are dangerous, not like they are equals, but like they are part of the landscape. Useful maybe, stubborn maybe, but manageable. "Can I help you?" Victor asked. Walter didn't step closer than he had to. "That fence you put up, it's on my land." Victor's expression barely changed. He had the good manners of a man who could afford to be smug without raising his voice. "I don't believe that's correct, Mr. Hensley." "Walter Hensley." Victor nodded like that rang some faint bell. "Mr. Hensley, the boundary was professionally surveyed." "Then your survey is wrong." Victor folded the handkerchief once, slow and neat. "I hired a licensed company. They used current methods. KPS, deed interpretation, proper markers. The county has the filing." He said it the way a priest might say scripture to somebody he considered undereducated. Walter held his eyes. "My family has worked that line since before you ever set foot in Iowa. And I don't doubt your family remembers it a certain way." That little phrase hung there. Remembers it a certain way. As though a man walking the same ground for decades was somehow less trustworthy than a stack of paper created last month by strangers taking measurements for a paycheck. "That pasture belongs to me," Walter said. Victor gave a patient smile, and that smile did more damage than shouting would have. "I'm afraid memory and ownership are not the same thing." Walter could feel the heat rising under his collar, but he didn't give Victor the satisfaction of seeing him lose his temper. "You moved a fence." Victor shook his head lightly. "I installed a fence according to a legal survey." "You stole 40 acres. That finally got something sharper in Victor's eyes. Not guilt, Not fear, just irritation that the old farmer in front of him had not accepted the script. "Those are serious words," he said. "Then take them serious." For a second, neither man spoke. Workers nearby were pretending very hard not to listen. Then Victor glanced back toward the trailer, toward the papers and plans and men he trusted more than the one standing before him. "If you have a concern, you're free to consult counsel." Counsel. Walter almost laughed at that. A man like Victor said counsel, because lawyer was too ordinary a word. "Maybe I will," Walter said. Victor nodded. "Already done with him. Then I suppose that's the proper place for this discussion." Walter looked out toward the line again, toward the stolen ground, then back at Victor. "My grandfather knew this kind of thing happened." That got Victor's attention for reasons Walter couldn't yet name. "Did he?" "He did." "And what did he do about it?" Walter let the silence sit a moment. He made sure the truth would still be there. Victor gave a short laugh. "Well, when your truth shows up in county records, feel free to let me know." Walter stood there one beat longer, studying the man. Soft hands, good coat, a face too used to getting what it wanted. Then he turned and walked back to his truck without another word. Men, watching from a distance, stepped out of his way. On the drive home, he didn't switch on the radio. He just kept both hands on the wheel and let old memories start working their way loose. Not clear at first, more like the edge of something. A Sunday years ago, his father Henry talking while they checked the fence. Something about August not trusting paper. Something about markers that couldn't be moved. Walter parked in front of the barn and sat there a moment before getting out. Ruth met him on the porch. "How'd it go?" "About how you'd expect." "He laugh at you?" Walter looked at her. Not in so many words. She nodded. That was enough. After supper, Walter went out to the barn with a flashlight, climbed to the loft, and started opening boxes and trunks that hadn't been touched in years. Feed records, old harness leather, receipts tied with string, land tax papers, a tobacco tin with bolts and nails. He moved slow because this wasn't desperation yet. It was memory trying to find its footing. He kept hearing his father's voice. Your grandfather didn't trust posts, didn't trust stone, didn't trust what could be moved by a man with a shovel and bad intentions. Walter sat back on his heels and closed his eyes, and then it came a little clearer. Not fence posts, not stone markers. Iron. There had been iron. Heavy iron. Stove lids, Henry had said once, in that offhand tone fathers use when they don't realize they are giving you something you might need decades later. August had buried them. 6 of them. 6 feet deep. Walter opened another trunk and found old family papers wrapped in cloth. Deeds. Letters. Photographs with curled edges. He set them aside carefully, one stack becoming 2, then 3. Dust rose around him. The light from the flashlight shifted every time he moved. He didn't know yet whether he was looking for proof or chasing after a story told long ago by men who were gone now. But he knew one thing for certain. Victor Kessler was betting on time, betting that memory was weak, that old men died, that sons forgot, that paper filed in a courthouse would matter more than the truth laid down by people who had actually lived on the ground. Men like Victor always bet on that. They bet that regular people get tired, that they get outspent, that they lose heart. Walter was not naive. He knew how these fights usually ended. He had seen neighbors go up against banks, developers, agencies, companies that could drag a matter out until being right cost more than giving in. He knew surveys cost money and lawyers cost more, and every letter sent through a courtroom had a way of turning a working man's life into somebody else's schedule. That was the part city men never understood. A farmer could be right and still lose because the season wouldn't wait, and bills wouldn't wait, and cattle wouldn't wait, and the land itself would not stand around while lawyers argued over language. Walter knew all of that, knew it so well it sat in his bones. And still he kept opening boxes. Around 10 o'clock, he found an old diary, leather cracked with age, pages yellowed but intact. August's hand. German-born, careful script, the kind that belonged to a man who wasted neither motion nor words. Walter sat there on the loft floor and started turning pages. Weather, prices, planting notes, repairs, church, births, small entries, most of them. A life recorded by a man too busy to write much, but too disciplined not to write at all. Walter turned page after page, breathing a little faster now, not because he had found what he needed, but because he was close to the years he wanted. Then he stopped. His flashlight stayed fixed on one line, while the rest of the barn seemed to fall away. Buried the markers today. 6 lids. 6 feet deep. Henry helped. The line is set forever. Walter read it again. Then again. Not because he doubted it, but because once was not enough after all those years of half-remembering. He sat very still with that diary in his hands and felt something change inside him. Not relief. Not yet. But the shape of a path where before there had only been anger. He looked around the loft, then back down at the page. Somewhere in that barn, maybe in those boxes, maybe only in his own memory, was the beginning of an answer Victor Kessler had not imagined. Walter closed the diary carefully and rested it on his knee. Then he said out loud to nobody, "All right, Grandpa, let's see what you left me." And that was the moment the fight truly began. Not out by the moved fence, not in front of Victor's polished trailer, but in the dark of an Iowa barn with an old man's handwriting under a farmer's hands and 40 stolen acres waiting outside for someone to remember exactly where the truth had been buried. Victor Kessler did not think about Walter Hensley again that night, and that was the first mistake he made, though he would not recognize it as such for quite some time. Because men like Victor rarely saw quiet people as dangerous, and Walter had been quiet, measured, almost old-fashioned in the way he spoke, which Victor translated as weakness instead of restraint. And by the time Walter climbed down from the barn loft with that diary in his hand, Victor had already convinced himself that And Walter shook his head slowly, not exact, not yet. And that was honest, because memory after 40 years does not come back clean. It comes in pieces, fragments of walks, turns, distances counted without numbers. And he could see himself as a boy beside his father, walking that same line, hearing things he didn't understand at the time. But now those pieces were starting to move into place. And what mattered was not that he remembered everything, but that he remembered enough to start. And the next morning he went out earlier than usual, before the sun had burned off the cool from the night. And he didn't walk the new fence. He ignored it completely, because to Walter that line didn't exist. He went instead to the cottonwood tree, the one August had planted, and he stood there with his hands in his pockets, looking east across the land that had been all his life. And he closed his eyes for a moment, not in prayer, not exactly, but in concentration, letting the rhythm of old walks come back to him, the way his father had paced it, steady, deliberate, counting without counting. And then he started walking, not fast, not slow, just the way he always had, one foot in front of the other, eyes forward, measuring distance the way farmers do when they have walked the same ground for decades. And somewhere around where he felt the first marker should be, he stopped, looked down, and drove a wooden stake into the ground. Then he kept going, same pace, same direction, and stopped again, another stake. And he did this 6 times, marking what he believed were the spots August had chosen, each one separated by a distance that had been taught to him so long ago it had become instinct more than memory. And when he finished, he stood there looking at those 6 points spread across land now, claimed by another man's fence. And for the first time since this had started, he felt something close to certainty, not proof yet, not victory, but direction. And direction was something Victor Kessler did not have, because Victor was working from documents and interpretations and the assumption that the past could be reshaped if you were willing to pay for it, while Walter was working from something older, something placed in the ground by a man who had already seen what happened when land and truth were left to arguments on paper. And later that day, Walter went back to town, not to a lawyer, not yet, but to the county office, where he asked to see the filed survey, and the clerk, who had known him for years, pulled the documents without much fuss, and Walter stood there reading lines and coordinates that meant less to him than the feel of dirt under his boots. But he could see enough to understand what had been done. The language was careful. The interpretation leaned just enough in one direction to pull that 40 acres into Kessler's boundary. And it was all neat, all official, all stamped and signed in a way that made it look final. And that was the point that was always the point. Make it look final so the man on the other side decides it isn't worth fighting. And the clerk watched him for a moment and said quietly, "You going to challenge it?" And Walter folded the paper back the way he had found it and said, "I might." And she nodded, not offering advice, just understanding the weight of what that meant, because everyone in that office had seen how these things usually played out. And on the drive home, Walter thought about lawyers, about costs, about time, about what it would take to push back against a man who could afford to keep pushing long after it stopped making sense for anyone else. And he did not fool himself. He knew exactly how uneven this was, but he also knew something Victor did not, something written in that diary and buried in that ground. And that changed the calculation in a way no amount of money could fully control. That evening he sat with Ruth again and laid it out plain. "If I take this to court, it's going to cost." And she said, "Everything costs." And he nodded. "He's got lawyers ready. I don't." And she looked at him the way she had looked at him for 40 years, steady, without fear. "Then you'll have to be right." And that was not comfort. It was truth. And Walter understood it that way, because being right was the only advantage he had. And even that only mattered if he could prove it in a way the court would accept. And that brought him back to the 6 stakes out in the pasture, to the iron buried beneath them, to the decision his grandfather had made decades earlier to trust something that could not be argued into being something else. And 2 days later, Walter drove back to the Kessler property, not to argue this time, not to raise his voice, but to give the man one more chance to step away before things went further. And Victor met him again near the trailer, less patient this time, already annoyed by the fact that the matter had not resolved itself. "Mr. Hensley, I thought we were clear," he said, and Walter nodded once. "We are," and Victor frowned slightly, not expecting agreement. "Then I don't understand why you're here." And Walter held his gaze. "Because I'm going to file." And there was a pause, not long, but enough for Victor to register the shift, because up until that moment this had been, in his mind, a local inconvenience, something that would pass. And now it was something else, something formal, something that might require attention, though not yet concern. And he said, "You're making a mistake." And Walter answered, "Maybe." And Victor gave a small, tight smile. "You don't have the resources for this." And Walter didn't argue the point. Probably not. And that unsettled Victor more than denial would have, because men like him expect resistance to come in predictable forms: anger, threats, bluster, not calm acceptance of disadvantage. And Walter went on, "But I've got something you don't." And Victor's eyes narrowed just a fraction. "And what would that be?" And Walter said, "Time." And that sounded almost absurd coming from a man who clearly had less of it left than the one he was speaking to. But Walter did not mean his own time. He meant August time. The years already spent, the preparation already made, the truth already placed in the ground, waiting for someone to dig it up. And Victor shook his head, dismissing it. "You should speak to a lawyer before you do anything else." And Walter said, "I will." And then he turned and left again. And this time Victor watched him go a little longer, because something about that exchange had not gone the way it should have, not in the clean, controlled way Victor was used to. And back at the farm, Walter began the work that would decide everything. Not loud work, not visible work, but the kind that builds toward a moment no one else sees coming. He gathered his grandfather's papers, sorted them, matched dates, found photographs that showed the old fence line before it had been moved, images where the cottonwood stood clearly inside Hensley land, not on the edge of someone else's claim. He read the diary entries around the date of the markers again and again. looking for anything that might fix their positions more precisely. And at night, he lay awake, going over the distances in his head, walking them in memory until they felt right, until they matched the stakes he had placed. And over the next weeks, he did what men in his position have always done when they have no money, but refused to give up. He learned. He went to the library, checked out books on property law, read them slowly, sometimes twice, not because he enjoyed it, but because he needed to understand the rules of a game that was not designed for him. He typed his own documents on an old machine that stuck on certain keys, corrected mistakes by hand, drove into town to file them, stood in lines behind people who had easier problems, and all the while the fence stood where it had been moved, cutting through. His pasture like a statement that dared him to do something about it. And every Sunday he still walked the line, the real line, not the one on paper, because habit is stronger than insult, and because walking it kept the truth clear in his mind. And somewhere during those weeks, word started to spread, the way it does in small counties, quiet first, then a little louder, people talking at the feed store, at church, at auctions, about Walter Hensley taking on a Chicago millionaire over 40 acres. And most of them knew how that usually ended. They had seen it before, and some shook their heads, not in judgment, but in recognition of what he was up against, while others watched more closely, because there was something about the way Walter was going about it that didn't fit the usual pattern. He wasn't ranting, he wasn't threatening, he wasn't trying to win in the way men like Victor expected. He was preparing, and preparation, done right, does not look like much until the moment. It matters. And by the time the court date was set, nearly a year after that morning when Walter first saw the moved fence, he had everything he could gather laid out in careful order: the diary, the photographs, the deed. And out in the pasture, 6 stakes marking 6 places were something older than any survey weighted in the ground. And Walter stood there one evening as the light dropped low over the land and looked at those points again. And he said quietly, not to Ruth this time, not to anyone, "If this works, it's because you saw it coming." And for a moment he allowed himself to think about August, about the man who had stood on that same ground decades earlier and decided that one day someone might try to take what was his, and that the only way to answer that kind of man was to leave behind something he could not move, could not argue away, could not buy. And then Walter turned back toward the house, because the next part would not be done in a field, it would be done in a courtroom. And everything would come down to whether what lay buried 6 feet under Iowa soil could still speak loud enough to be heard above money, above paper, above everything Victor Kessler believed could not be beaten. By the time the court date was set, Walter Hensley had already lived with that fence for nearly a year. And in that time something had changed in him, not in a way most people would notice, but in the way a man settles into a decision. He knows he won't walk back, because once he put his name on those papers and handed them over in that courthouse, this stopped being a private wrong and became a public fight. And public fights have a way of taking on a life of their own, especially when one side has money and the other does not. And Victor Kessler understood that better than most, which is why he did not treat the filing lightly, even if he pretended to at first. Because while he did not respect Walter as an equal, he did respect risk, and lawsuits carried risk, not necessarily of losing, but of inconvenience, of time, of attention, and so within weeks of being served, Victor had assembled what men like him always assembled: a legal team that did not just respond, but pressed, pushed, complicated, delayed, and stretched every part of the process until it favored the one who could afford to keep going. And the first letter Walter received from Victor's lawyers made that clear in a tone that was polite on the surface and hard underneath: a request for documents, for clarification, for compliance with procedures Walter had only just begun to understand. And when he read it at the kitchen table, Ruth standing behind him, he did not react the way a man might when faced with something designed to overwhelm him. He simply folded it once, set it down, and said, "They're going to make this expensive." And Ruth answered, "Then we keep it simple. And that became the way he approached it, because he did not have the luxury of fighting on every front. He had to pick the one place where the truth was strongest and hold to it. And over the following months, that is exactly what he did. He answered what he could, ignored what did not matter, and refused to be pulled into arguments that had nothing to do with where that fence had stood for decades. While on the other side, Victor's lawyers filed motions that were meant less to win outright and more to wear him down, motions to dismiss, motions to narrow the case, motions that required responses written in language Walter had never used before. And there were days when he sat at that table late into the evening, papers spread out in front of him, reading the same paragraph 3 or 4 times just to be sure he understood what was being asked of him. And in those moments, the imbalance of it all became very clear, because this was not just about land anymore. It was about a system built in such a way that a man like Victor could move through it easily, while a man like Walter had to learn it piece by piece. But every time that weight started to press too hard, Walter would think about those 6 stakes out in the pasture, about what lay beneath them, and that would bring him back to the one thing that had not changed. The truth was still there. It had not moved. And as long as he could get it in front of the right person at the right time, the rest of it might not matter as much as Victor believed. And so, instead of trying to match Victor's resources, Walter focused on timing, on sequence, on making sure that when the moment came, he would not be explaining, he would be showing. And that distinction mattered more than any legal argument he could have made, because Walter understood something Victor did not. People can argue about words, about interpretations, about what a document might mean, but it is much harder to argue with something you can hold in your hands. And so he waited, he let the process run its course. He appeared when he was required to appear, spoke when he needed to speak, and kept the rest of his effort directed toward preparing the one thing that could not be dismissed as easily as a farmer's memory. And during that time, Victor did what he always did when faced with resistance. He applied pressure, not directly, not in ways that could be easily challenged, but through the system itself, through delays, through demands, through the slow tightening of a situation that most people would eventually step away from just to make it stop. And there were moments when it almost worked, when Walter looked at the growing stack of papers. At the time, he was spending away from the work that actually mattered to him, and wondered if this was a fight that made sense. But then he would walk that line again, see that fence cutting through land that had been his family's for over 50 years, and the question would answer itself, because some things, once taken, do not come back unless someone is willing to stand in the way. And Walter had already decided he would be that someone. And as the trial approached, the shape of the case became clearer. Victor's side would present what they had paid for: a professional survey, expert testimony, documentation filed properly and supported by people who spoke the language of the court fluently. And Walter would present what he had, which on the surface looked like less: a diary, photographs, his own testimony, and whatever he chose to bring from the ground itself. And to anyone watching from the outside, it would have looked uneven, even hopeless, because in disputes like this, the appearance of authority often carries more weight than the memory of a man who has lived on the land. And that was exactly what Victor was counting on, that the judge would look at both sides and choose the one that came with credentials, with polished arguments, with the kind of presentation that signaled legitimacy. And in most cases, he would have been right. And that is why, 3 days before the trial, Walter did something that changed the entire balance of the case. He filed a motion with the court, a simple request on paper, but one that carried more weight than it seemed, asking for permission to excavate 6 specific locations on the disputed property and present the findings as evidence. And when Victor's lawyers received notice of that motion, they did not immediately recognize its significance, because on its face it looked like a last attempt by a man with limited options to find something, anything, that might support his claim. And they had seen that before. They had seen desperate moves, last-minute efforts, evidence that did not hold up under word, not out of hesitation, But out of respect for the moment, because this was where everything his grandfather had done decades earlier would either hold or fail, and when the shovel broke the surface, cutting through soil that had not been disturbed in years, Walter watched closely, not speaking, not rushing, just waiting, and as the hole deepened, as the men dug carefully, layer by layer, the air around them grew quiet in a way that had nothing to do with sound. It was the kind of quiet that comes when people are watching something they cannot yet name. And at around 6 feet, the shovel struck something solid, a dull, unmistakable sound that carried up through the handle and into the hands of the man holding it. And he stopped, looked up at Walter, and Walter nodded once. And they cleared the dirt more carefully then, brushing it away until the shape beneath began to show, round, dark, heavy with age. And when they finally lifted it out of the ground, it was exactly what August had written about: a cast iron stove lid, thick, worn, marked by time in a way that could not be faked. And for a moment none of them said anything, because the significance of it did not need to be explained. It was there in their hands, and the weight of it, in the way it had stayed exactly where it had been placed decades earlier. And Walter stepped forward, took it, turned it over, and saw the markings his grandfather had described. German lettering, a date that reached back long, before any of this had started. And that was when he allowed himself the first small sign of satisfaction. Not relief, not yet, but confirmation, because this was not chance, this was not hope. This was proof beginning to take shape, and they moved to the second stake, then the third, and each time the result was the same depth, the same iron, the same quiet moment when something buried long ago came back into the light. And by the time they had uncovered all 6, laid out in a row on the grass, there was no longer any doubt. Not for Walter, not for the men who had helped him, and not for anyone who would later see them. That the line his grandfather had set was real, fixed, and older than any survey Victor could produce. And Walter looked at those 6 pieces of iron and understood that the fight had shifted, not ended, but shifted, because up until that moment, he had been reacting to what Victor had done, and now, for the first time, he had something Victor would have to answer, something that did not depend on interpretation or argument, something that existed whether anyone believed in it or not. And as they loaded the lids into the back of his truck, covering them carefully, Walter said quietly, "We'll let the court see them." And one of the men asked, "You think that'll be enough?" And Walter paused before answering, not because he doubted it, but because he understood the nature of what was coming next. "It's the truth," he said. "We'll find out if that's enough." And with that, he closed the tailgate, got into the truck, and drove back toward a courthouse where in a matter of days, everything that had been buried would be brought out into the open. And a man who believed he had already won would learn that some things cannot be taken simply because you can afford to claim them. The morning of the trial did not feel dramatic, and that was the first thing that struck Walter as he got dressed, because after a year of tension, of paperwork, of walking that same line over and over again with a different kind of weight in his chest, he might have expected something heavier in the air. But what he felt instead was a kind of steady quiet, the kind that comes when a man has already done everything he can and there is nothing left but to show it. Ruth made him breakfast like she always did: eggs, toast, coffee, and neither of them said much because there wasn't anything left to say that hadn't already been said in smaller pieces over the months. And when he finished, he stood at the sink for a moment, looking out toward the pasture, toward the line that had started all of this. And then he turned, picked up a jacket, and said, "Time," and Ruth nodded, "Time," and that was enough. They drove into town together, the truck running the same roads Walter had driven most of his life. But that morning it felt different, not because the road had changed, but because the destination had. And when they pulled up near the courthouse, there were more trucks than usual, more cars, people standing in small groups, talking in low voices because word had spread farther than Walter expected. Farmers from neighboring counties, men who had heard about the case and understood what it meant beyond 40 acres. Because if something like this could happen to Walter, could happen to any of them. And they weren't there for spectacle. They were there to see if the kind of thing they feared had an answer. Walter stepped out of the truck, and for a moment he just took it in, not the crowd, not the building, but the fact that this had gone from a quiet morning on his land to this. And then he walked forward, steady as always, not fast, not slow, and people stepped aside without making a show of it. A few nodded, a few said his name, and he acknowledged them the same way he always did, with a slight nod, no extra words, because he had never been a man for speeches, and inside the courtroom was already filling, the air carrying that mix of wood, paper, and expectation that comes when something matters to more than just the people at the front. Walter took his seat at the plaintiff's table alone, no lawyer beside him, no stack of polished binders. Just a cardboard box containing everything he had brought, the diary, the photographs, and the knowledge of what waited outside in the truck. And across from him, Victor Kessler sat with 3 attorneys, all of them in suits that fit the room better than Walter's jacket did, their table covered in files, tabs, documents arranged in a way that suggested control, preparation, confidence. And Victor himself looked composed, not relaxed, but certain, the way a man looks when he believes the outcome has already been decided in his favor. And when his eyes met Walter's, there was no recognition of equal ground, just a brief acknowledgement before his attention shifted back to his attorneys, as if Walter were already part of something concluded. And when Judge Emerson entered, the room settled quickly, chairs scraping once, and then stillness. And the proceedings began the way they always do, formal, structured, moving through the opening steps with a rhythm that did not care about the history behind it. Victor's side went first, as expected, and they presented their case. With precision, laying out the survey, the credentials of the firm that conducted it, the methods used, the filings with the county, every piece of it designed to show that what had been done was not only legal, but proper, and they spoke in language that carried weight in that room, terms that aligned with the system, references to standards, to interpretations, to authority, and to anyone listening without context. It sounded complete. It sounded like the kind of case that should not be overturned. And when their expert took the stand, explaining how the original deed had been interpreted, how the boundary had been determined, it added another layer, another reason for the judge to see this as settled. And Walter sat through all of it without interruption, hands folded, listening, not because he agreed, but because he understood that none of this was his ground. This was their ground, and they were strong on it. And when they finished, there was a brief pause, the kind that comes when one side has laid out its case and expects the other to struggle to match it. And then it was Walter's turn, and he stood up slowly, not out of hesitation, but because he was not a man who rushed into anything, and he walked to the front, facing the judge, not the opposing table. And for a moment he said nothing, just stood there, and in that silence there was something that shifted, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough that people in the room leaned in just a little because they could feel that this was not going to follow the same pattern. And Walter spoke in the same voice he had used his whole life, steady, direct, without extra weight. Your Honor, I filed the motion 3 days ago to excavate 6 locations on the disputed property, and the judge nodded. That motion was granted. Walter continued. And yesterday morning, we carried out that excavation, and before Victor's lawyers could fully react, Walter turned slightly and gestured toward the back of the room, where 2 men stepped forward, the same men who had been with him in the pasture, carrying a wooden crate between them. And the sound of it being set down at the front of the courtroom was louder than it should have been, not because of the volume, but because of what it signaled. And one of Victor's attorneys stood quickly. Your Honor, we object, he said. We were not present for this excavation. And Judge Emerson looked at him calmly. You were notified, he said. You chose not to attend. And that ended that line of objection before it could take hold. And Walter moved to the crate, knelt slightly, and opened it, not with any flourish, not trying to create a moment, just doing what needed to be done. And when he lifted the first piece of iron out, there was a change in the room that did not need to be explained, because what he held was not paper, not a diagram, not something that could be argued into different meanings. It was real, heavy, marked by time in a way that no recent action could replicate. And he placed it on the bench in front of the judge, then another and another, until all six were there, lined up, each one carrying the same quiet weight. And Walter spoke again. "These were buried by my grandfather in 1947, he said, 6 feet deep, spaced along the boundary of our property. And he picked one up, turning it so the markings were visible. This one was made in Germany before my grandfather came to this country." And he set it back down. "We found all 6 exactly where they were supposed to be. And now there was no sound at all in the room, because this was not the kind of evidence people were used to seeing. This did not come from a recent survey. This did not come from interpretation. This came from the ground itself." And Walter continued, "Each one was at the same depth, each one the same distance apart, and every one of them is inside the fence Mr. Kessler built." And for the first time since the trial had begun, Victor's composure broke, not completely, not in a way that drew attention to itself immediately, but enough that those closest to him saw it. The slight shift, the realization that something had entered the case that he had not accounted for. And his attorneys leaned toward each other, whispering quickly, papers moving, trying to find a way to address what was now in front of them. And Walter did not raise his voice, did not push, did not dramatize. He simply let the evidence sit there, because it did not need help. It did not need explanation beyond what it already showed. And when he finished, he stepped back, returning to his table, leaving the 6 pieces of iron where they were, and the courtroom remained quiet for a few seconds longer than usual. The kind of pause that comes when everyone present understands that the balance of something has just shifted, even if they cannot yet say exactly how. And Judge Emerson leaned forward, examining the lids more closely, not rushing, not dismissing, but giving them the attention they demanded. And in that moment, the case was no longer about whose documents were more polished or whose arguments were more refined. It was about whether something placed in the ground decades earlier could outweigh something created on paper months ago, and everyone in that room knew, without saying it, that they were about to find out. Judge Emerson did not rush, and that mattered more than anything anyone had said up to that point, because a rushed decision would have felt like a continuation of everything that had come before, quick conclusions built on what looked official. But instead he took his time. He examined each piece of iron the way a man examines something he knows may outlast him, turning one slightly, looking at the markings, the wear, the edges that had not been touched in decades. And when he finally leaned back, the room seemed to hold its breath without anyone meaning to. Victor's attorneys were ready. They stood again, voices controlled but tighter now, trying to bring the focus back to procedure, to argue that these items, whatever they were, could not override a professional survey, that there was no guarantee of when they had been placed, that the court should rely on documented interpretation rather than what they called anecdotal artifacts. And it was a good argument, the kind that usually worked, the kind that had worked for Victor his entire career, because it shifted the conversation back into the language he understood, the language of systems and authority and controlled outcomes. But this time something in that room had changed, and it was not loud, not obvious, but it was there in the way the judge listened without nodding, in the way the words seemed to land a little softer than they were meant to. And when Walter was given the chance to speak again, he did not try to out-argue them. He did not step into that space at all. He simply walked forward, picked up one of the lids again, and said, "Your Honor, my grandfather buried these in 1947. And he paused, not for effect, but because he wanted the words to stand on their own. He did it because he knew paper could be changed, markers could be moved, and people could be convinced of things that weren't true. He set the lid back down gently, but he also knew that if he put something in the ground that no one else had, something that couldn't be faked later, then someday, if someone tried to take what wasn't theirs, we'd have a way to show where the line really was." And that was all he said, No long explanation, no attempt to dress it up, just a statement of intent from a man long gone, carried forward by someone who had not forgotten. And when he stepped back again, the silence returned, but it was different now. It was not the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence of recognition. And Judge Emerson looked down at the 6 pieces of iron one more time, then at the documents on Victor's table. And when he spoke, his voice carried the kind of finality that does not need to be raised to be heard. "The evidence presented by the plaintiff is compelling," he said, "and it is consistent in a way that cannot be ignored." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "The artifacts are clearly of significant age. Their placement corresponds with the boundary described in the original deed when properly interpreted, and their existence predates the recent survey by several decades." Victor's attorneys started to rise again, but the judge continued, not giving them room. "The survey submitted by the defendant is therefore called into question, and in light of the evidence presented, it is the finding of this court that the boundary between the Hensley and Kessler properties is established along the line marked by these artifacts." And there it was. The moment everything shifted from possibility to fact. The defendant is ordered to remove the fence from the plaintiff's property within 30 days. And even before he finished, the weight of that decision settled across the room, because everyone understood what it meant, not just for Walter, but for the idea that something like this could be done and undone. The defendant is further ordered to pay damages in the amount of $40,000 for unlawful use of the land. And at that, Victor did not move. Not at first. He sat there with his hands on the table, looking at the lids as if they were something he had never considered could exist. And in a way, they were, because everything he had built his confidence on had no place for something like that. No column for iron buried in the ground by a man who planned for a future he would not see. And for the first time since Walter had stood in front of his trailer months earlier, Victor looked uncertain, not loudly, not in a way that drew attention from across the room, but in the small ways that matter. A tightening of the jaw, a shift of the eyes, the absence of that easy certainty he had carried with him into every other deal. And his attorneys leaned in quickly, already speaking in low voices about appeals, about next steps, about how to contain what had just happened. But even they knew, even as they spoke, that something fundamental had gone wrong for them, because this was not a matter that could be easily reinterpreted, not when the evidence sat there in front of everyone, heavy, silent, and older than any of their arguments. And Walter did not react the way some might expect. He did not smile, did not celebrate, did not turn to the crowd. He simply stood there, hands at his sides, and let the words settle. Because for him, this was not about victory in the way others understood it. It was about something being put back where it belonged. And when the judge dismissed the case, the room broke into motion again, voices returning, people standing, the quiet giving way to a low hum of conversation. And as Walter gathered his things, a few men stepped forward, shaking his hand, not with excitement, but with respect, the kind of respect that passes between people who understand what it costs to stand your ground when everything around you suggests you shouldn't. And outside the courthouse, the air felt different, lighter in a way that had nothing to do with the weather, and Ruth stood beside him, not saying much, just placing her hand lightly on his arm. And after a moment she said, "You did it." And Walter shook his head slightly. "No," he said, "he did." And she knew who he meant, because this had started long before either of them were there to see it. And in the weeks that followed, Victor Kessler did what men like him always do when something does not go their way. He tried to change it. His lawyers filed an appeal, argued points of procedure, questioned the handling of the evidence. But the foundation of the decision did not move, because the facts beneath it did not move. And when the appeal was denied, the outcome became final. The fence came down, not in a dramatic moment, not with crowds watching, but piece by piece, the way it had gone up, and the land returned to the side it had always belonged to. And not long after, Victor sold the Miller property quietly at a loss and left Iowa behind, returning to a world where things worked the way he expected them to. While the surveying company that had conducted the original work faced consequences of its own, losing its license, its reputation, its place, in a profession that depends on trust more than anything else, and back on the Hensley farm, life returned to its rhythm, the kind of rhythm that does not announce itself but continues season after season. Walter still walked the fence line every Sunday, not because he had to prove anything anymore, but because that was what he had always done, and the 6 stove lids, cleaned and set on a shelf in the barn, became something more than pieces of iron. They became a reminder, not of the fight, but of the reason the fight had been possible. And years later, when Walter was older and his steps a little slower, he walked that same line with his grandson Michael, the two of them moving at a pace that matched the conversation. And Michael asked him about it, about the case, about the lids, about how he had known what to do. And Walter told him the truth. "I almost didn't remember," he said, "if I hadn't been paying attention. If I hadn't gone looking, it might have been gone." And Michael thought about that, about how close something like that can come to being lost. Not because it is taken, but because it is forgotten. And when they reached the cottonwood, Walter stopped, resting his hand against the bark, and said, "That's why you listen." And Michael nodded, not fully understanding yet, but understanding enough. And years after that, when the farm passed to him, he kept the same habit, walking the line every Sunday, stopping at the same places, remembering where the markers had been. And once a year, the family gathered, not for the case itself, but for the people behind it, telling the story not as a victory, but as a lesson that some things are only yours as long as you remember them, and that sometimes the only way to protect what matters is to think further ahead than the man who wants to take it. And in the barn, the 6 stove lids remain where Walter had left them, not buried anymore, not hidden, but visible, solid, patient, the kind of objects that do not change. With time, waiting without effort, carrying with them the quiet truth that had once been placed in the ground and left there for as long as it took, until the day came when someone needed to dig it up and let it speak.